2023 ended, the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court began trading even more confidential than usual memos, avoiding their standard email list and instead passing paper documents in envelopes to each chambers. Faced with ethics controversies and a plunge in public trust, they were debating rules for their own conduct, according to people familiar with the process. Justice Gorsuch was especially vocal in opposing any enforcement mechanism beyond voluntary compliance, arguing that additional measures could undermine the court. In the private exchanges, Justice Clarence Thomas, whose decision not to disclose decades of gifts and luxury vacations from wealthy benefactors had sparked the ethics controversy. And Justice Samuel Alito wrote off the court's critics as politically motivated and unappeasable. The three liberal justices insisted that the rules needed to be more than lofty promises, but their argument never had a chance. The New York Times spoke with Jeremy Fogel, a retired federal judge appointed by President Bill Clinton, who noted that an ethics code is not a blue-red issue. If confidence in the Supreme Court tanks, then confidence in the whole system tanks. And that's the direction confidence seems to be heading, according to the polls. Gallup reports, based on a survey they conducted in September, this, quote, at 48%, the proportion of Americans who have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the federal government's judicial branch is statistically similar to the 2022 record low, 47%, and 2023, 49% ratings. Before 2022, trust in the judicial branch had never been below the majority level and typically exceeded 60%. Holding the justices of our highest court to the same standards as other federal judges would likely help fix or address that crisis in confidence. And yet, a majority of those on the court seem unwilling to take that next step. That's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times investigative reporter Jodi Kenter is here. She's bylined on that extraordinary new piece of reporting. Also joining us, executive director of Fix the Court, Gabe Roth, is back, and with me at the table, MSNBC legal analyst and NYU law professor Melissa Murray is here. So, Jodi, this is an incredible piece of reporting. I'm going to ask you just to take us through it.
Sure. So a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, the justices introduced a new ethics code. It was really quite a moment because, unlike other federal judges, as you said, they had never really had a formal one. And they announced it with unanimity. It was 9-0. They agreed. That was really seen by many people as a step forward. However, the big question on the table was, what about enforcement? The rules were kind of a symbolic promise on paper. And so we asked the natural question, which is, how did the justices come up with these rules for themselves? That alone is a fascinating question. 9 people who decide rules and interpret the law for the rest of the country go into a room alone in secret and make parameters for themselves. But then beyond that, what happened with this concept of enforcement? And that turned out to be the big split among the justices. I mean, basically, they were divided roughly along partisan lines. The 3 liberals really made the case that, hey, rules aren't fully rules if they don't have some sort of enforcement attached to them. They have to mean something. And, they tried to introduce, Justice Elena Kagan tried to introduce a very kind of gentle step towards enforcement, a panel of very experienced federal judges who would be able to give the justices advice in private. However, there was really strong resistance. The most vocal justice was Justice Neil Gorsuch, and he had a powerful set of concerns about the independence of the court. Something to keep in mind is that the Supreme Court is different than other courts because it's the last word by definition. And he was very concerned with the prospect of putting anybody in place to essentially judge the justices. His point was that the independence of the court is sacred. It's the foundation, really, of the whole operation. And once you put somebody else in a position to judge the justices, he was very worried that it had the potential to go south, to be corrupted. And essentially, there was not enough support on the court for an enforcement mechanism. What our sources told us is that the idea really only got so far. And so this disagreement now has spilled into public. And two of the justices, I think you played some tape of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson speaking about it on a podcast. Justice Elena Kagan has been vocal as well. And some of the conservative response has really been furious. And part of what we see and part of what our reporting is about this very sensitive, almost awkward debate inside the Supreme Court, this very delicate question about their own conduct, turning into an enforcement debate and then turning into a much more blistering debate in public. What's happening now is essentially that many liberals are saying, why is there no enforcement mechanism? This is suspect. It adds. We had reader comments today from people saying this adds to my suspicions that this court is corrupt and out of touch with reality. But then you have a very strong conservative point of view saying the people who are pushing enforcement are undermining the rule of law. They could really put the Supreme Court in a lot of trouble. And there have even been accusations that say Justice Kagan, one activist even called her somewhat treasonous. And so this is feeling less like a kind of philosophical law school debate and more like a very ugly partisan shouting match. And the reason that is very concerning is because judicial ethics are supposed to be above politics. They're supposed to be a matter of agreement. And as Judge Fogel said, if confidence in the Supreme Court tanks, confidence in the entire system tanks.
I mean, Jody, the reporting makes clear that Gorsuch thinks that enforcement of ethics is the thing that threatens the independence of the court. Do any of them understand that it is the lack of compliance with the very lax ethics rules that do exist? I mean, none of the reporting about Clarence Thomas's gifts that went unreported bore out to be inaccurate. They were simply things that Clarence Thomas refused to report. And so amended and updated disclosures had all them on there. I mean, why does one thing threaten the court and the non-disclosure and non-compliance of disclosing gifts doesn't, in Gorsuch's telling?
Well, I can't answer for Justice Gorsuch, but what I can tell you is that there were many people we spoke with who really struggled with the concept of enforcement. For example, we spoke to the former Chief Justice of the Texas State Supreme Court. Now, state Supreme Courts are interesting to look at because they are, of course, the highest courts in their states. A lot of them have enforcement. I think almost all of them, Senator Whitehouse said yesterday, have enforcement mechanisms. But Chief Justice Jefferson said to me, and he was elected as a Republican, by the way, in Texas. You run with a party affiliation. And he said to me, Jody, I believe in enforcement as a concept, but I'm worried about it in this political climate. How do you get to fairness? How do you trust that the process will actually work?
Jody, you alluded to the fact that this resembles another institution sort of ravaged by this moment in partisan politics. I wonder if you have any reporting or insight into how that has changed the dynamics. I mean, Scalia and Ginsburg were famous friends. Is there warmth among the justices who have been appointed by presidents of different political parties?
I've heard examples that say yes. I've heard examples that say no. I'm hesitating to answer because we are really not there, and the court is so secretive that I don't want to exceed the boundaries of what I know. But I think the way I can answer your question is that, boy, reporting this story, both the material inside and outside the court, it had the feeling over, one of those debates where the two sides are not even speaking the same language.
Yeah.
The mistrust and lack of understanding in this debate is so marked. And it's especially striking because if you know anything about the federal bench, you know that there's a lot of tradition of judges who were appointed by different parties actually getting along pretty well, you know, coming to plenty of agreement about ethics. And also, so, you know, basically, lower court judges do have an enforcement system, and that's a fairly healthy, quiet system that has been ticking along in the background for a really long time. And then you get to this debate, and there are these outsized accusations that I think really speak to a lack of common trust and common understanding. I want to say one more thing to give you kind of the feel of this debate. I think it's notable that a lot of the discussion was really about one justice and his behavior, and that's Justice Clarence Thomas, of course, whose lack of disclosure of gifts really set off a lot of this debate. So there's kind of an awkward quality to that dynamic, right? Because everybody's debating what the entire Supreme Court should do, what it should do in the future. But really, it's not that there haven't been reports and problems about other justices. We list some of them in our article. But the lion's share of this discussion is really about one justice.
Melissa Marie, let me play some of what Jody's talking about. This is Justice Elena Kagan's, what I think Jody accurately described as sort of gentle suggestion for how this might work.
However hard it is that we could and should try to figure out some mechanism for doing this. You know, I would be pretty happy with, I have a lot of trust and faith in the Chief Justice. You know, if the Chief Justice appointed some sort of committee of, you know, highly respected judges with a great deal of experience, with a reputation for fairness, you know, that seems like a good solution to me. It would also, you know, benefit us in various kinds of ways because it would provide a sort of safe harbor. There are sometimes people accuse us of misconduct where we haven't engaged in misconduct. And so I think, you know, both in terms of enforcing the rules against people who have violated them, but also in protecting people who haven't violated them, I think a system like that would make sense.
So I asked a similar question of Justice Kagan when she came to NYU to do a conversation with us back in September, and she said the same thing. And I don't think it's an unreasonable fix here. There are lots of sort of situations where you have a board or review that you can go to ask these questions, and you can get an answer. And it does provide a safe harbor, it provides some cover. I don't know why the court is unwilling to do this. When they adopted the code of conduct last November, on our podcast, we joked that it was really a code of misconduct because it actually softened some of the requirements that previously had existed and made them merely discretionary. And that only exacerbated the fact that there was no enforcement mechanism for this. And you asked a really interesting question of Jody. Is there warmth or comedy amongst the justices today? And, I would turn the question over and ask, why does it matter? It mattered when Scalia and Ginsburg were on the court together because they suggested that their friendship relate a kind of open-mindedness, that they came to questions willing to listen to the other person. What we're seeing now, and I think what the public is responding to with these poll numbers,